Okay, welcome. In this video, we're going to offer some techniques in preparation for your exposure to the radar pattern as far as pacing, and we're also going to offer a technique in building the approach within the cockpit before you get into your briefing for the crew. So, here's our runway. We have the approach end and the departure end, and a normal box pattern looks like this. You're probably going to get something close to runway heading or maybe even a right turn or left turn to a certain altitude. But let's say for now our climb out instructions after our first instrument approach was runway heading to some altitude, so call it 3,000, who cares? So we're going to fly that runway heading to 3,000. They're going to give us a vector 90 degrees off. And then once we're down this, displaced a little bit, we're going to be turned on a vector downwind. And then once we're at a certain point on downwind, they're going to turn us on a base leg, and then a dog leg, and then to final. So, let me just, there we go, crosswind, downwind, base turn right here. Let's call this dog leg, and then final. And here we're going to talk about the pacing that goes into a standard box pattern for the radar environment when I'm doing multiple radar patterns. So let's say I've done my first instrument approach, I've done my touch and go, I've done my missed approach, whatever my maneuver is, and I'm climbing out and I'm cleaning up. So on your initial climb out instructions, there's a few things I want to do. First, obviously, I want to clean up the aircraft. Make sure I have my flaps and gear up. Next, I'm going to trim off the aircraft for hands off at about 180 knots. We always get into this mindset that because we're in the nav phase, we want to throw on the autopilot immediately. That's not the case here. Yes, we want you to understand how the autopilot works and how to use the flight director. However, I don't need those to fly a stable airplane right immediately after departure. So make sure the aircraft is configured appropriately, which means the gear's up, the flaps are up. Make sure it's trimmed off for hands-off flight, and I want to shoot for about 180 knots in the downwind as a technique. Once that's done, hand off the aircraft. Give up aircraft control to your instructor. You want to get the aircraft out of your hands in a manner of speaking as quickly as possible so you can get ready for your approach. But in the mindset of we want to be good aviators, we don't want to hand the aircraft off to the IP with it being out of trim, and we don't want to look like bad pilots when it's completely nose up or completely nose down or fast or slow. No, we want to be cleaned up, trimmed off, and a nice stable airspeed, and as a technique, 180 knots. Once we have the aircraft handed off to the instructor, we're going to go into the flow of our approach briefing and how we're going to get set up for that. All right, so there was our technique in developing your flow for the approach. Now, once we hand off the aircraft to, as a technique, beam the approach end of the runway, this is when we want to take back aircraft control. So we have all this space from handing off the aircraft to, as a technique, beam the approach end to get ready for the approach, to set it up, and to brief it. And all of our responsibilities during this time are to keep SA, understand where you are in the pattern, handle the radios, because now the IP is flying, we're the pilot monitoring, and brief the approach. Those are only things we need to worry about while the IP is flying and we're the pilot monitoring. Make sure you keep SA in the pattern, and that'll help you with the radios, because generally speaking, controllers keep you about 3 to 5 miles displaced from the runway, and then they're going to give you a downwind vector. So understand when you get about 3 to 5 miles from the runway, you're probably going to get a radio call that tells you to go opposite direction on downwind. All you got to do is read that out. And then I can work on briefing my approach. That's all I got to do in this time. Once I take back aircraft control, all my responsibility now is to maintain aircraft control. Easy enough. All we got to do is just fly what the controllers are directing us to do. What this also does is when I'm getting into single engine scenarios, the earlier I take back the aircraft, the quicker I can get into that single engine scenario, giving me a maximum amount of time to handle the scenario, call the scenario complete, and now I can just worry about trimming off the aircraft single engine. But in general, we want to get the aircraft back into our hands after the approach briefing about abeam the approach end. Now this is going to be different for every approach because some may require more nav aid changes, more frequency changes, whatever. Now as we move downwind, we're flying the aircraft. We're going to wait for a base leg, which is pretty much going to be a 90-degree right turn in this instance towards final. And lastly, once we get about, 2-ish miles away from the runway, maybe a little bit closer based on winds, they're going to give us a dogleg vector, and it's going to sound something like this. Turn right heading of 045, maintain 2000 until established, cleared the ILS approach. Cool. The pilot monitoring of the IP is going to read that back. What that tells me is that I am about to intercept final, and the 3 magic words I want to hear are cleared the approach. Now, when I hear cleared the approach, that's going to direct me to do a few things. It's going to activate my flight director to intercept final. That's going to tell me that I can descend once I'm established on the approach, whatever. But as far as pacing goes, I know that when I'm on that dogleg and he reads me off that long clearance, I'm getting ready to intercept final. And now my next item to look for is my FAF. Normally speaking, the controllers will vector you about 3 to 5 miles from the FAF, so I should have plenty of time to get established on my course, start descending to my FAF altitude, and configuring. So let's say 3 to 5 miles from the FAF is where they're going to help you intercept the final approach course. And in that point, things I want to do are make sure I'm descending if necessary to my FAF altitude and preparing to configure. And then once I'm configured, I'm just slowing to my approach speed for that particular approach. I'm waiting for my FAF for the passage, and then I'm going to go down to my minimums, whether it be my MDA or my decision altitude, if it's a precision versus a localized or versus a non-precision approach. And then I'm just flying the approach, and I'm going to do it to the maneuver that I pre-briefed. But in general, this is the standard pacing that you should look for in the radar pattern. From the departure end, you're going to clean up, trim the aircraft, fly about 180 knots. You're going to turn crosswind. Once it's trimmed up and you've got the aircraft under control, you're going to hand off the aircraft to the IP. When you're the pilot monitoring and the IP is flying, you're going to maintain your situational awareness. You're going to handle any radio calls, and you're going to brief the approach. And like we talked about before, there's a good technique in preparing for the approach and then briefing it. Once that's all done, I'm going to take back the aircraft. I'm going to maintain aircraft control, and I'm just going to fly the airplane, or maybe I need to get into my single engine scenario. But now I have all this time in the world up until intercepting final to get that done. I'm going to turn my base leg, and I'm going to get my dog leg clearance, which is what I'm looking for. Those 3 magical words is cleared the approach. That tells me I'm about to intercept final, so I should be preparing to turn to intercept final, and I want to prepare to descend to my FAF altitude and configure when appropriate. And again, they should vector you about 3 to 5 miles from the FAF, give or take. So you should have plenty of time to get configured and slowed to your V approach for that particular instrument approach that you're flying. I'm going to pass the FAF, and then I'm going to go down to my minimums and then complete the maneuver as necessary, either to a missed approach, a single engine landing, a touch and go, whatever. But you're just going to do that every time. And once you understand this, this will help you with your pacing and flow in the radar environment.